Victim lying on driveway. Stab wound. Husband, suspect number 3, standing there with blood on his hands and knife on the ground. Said he heard screaming and came out and looked the knife out to help wife. Got blood on his hands, said neighbor number 1. Suspect number 1. Standing at the end of the driveway, tall and blonde hair. Came over for lunch the day before. Husband said he overheard them arguing because suspect number 1 owed his wife, the victim, money. They had sandwiches and cut the loaf of bread with the knife on the ground. He said she took the knife home because she liked it and wanted to shop for one like it. Neighbor number 1, suspect number 1, said she returned the knife earlier in the day. She said was out for a walk and heard screaming. She said she arrived at the same time as husband came out of the garage. She has fresh scratches on her face that she says came from her dog's claws. She says that suspect number 2, neighbor number 2, standing on the side of the driveway next to her house, was angry at the victim because she doesn't prune her bushes. Suspect number 1 has a light-colored labradoodle. Neighbor number 2, suspect number 2, a short African-American woman, said she was in her bathroom, which is next to the victim's driveway, and heard screaming and came out. She said the husband was mad at the victim because she spent too much money on Amazon. She has a blood stain on her shorts. She said it was from a cut on her dog's paw. She also has a dog, a dark brown French bulldog. Victim has blood and hairs under her fingernails. There is a trace evidence of hairs in her chest. The suspect names: suspect number 1 is Miss Fegley, suspect number 2 is Miss Thornton, and suspect number 3 is Mr. Rothwell. Here at 2988 Hidden Falls Drive, case number 12345, I'm investigator Connor Andrew on the day of May 12th at 5:30, and the victim is Tina Rothwell. The search pattern we will use is a grid where you walk vertically and then horizontally. I'm going to measure the evidence. The most effective way to bag up hair into evidence is to wear gloves and pick it up with tweezers. All stained clothes need to be covered up with paper. The knife is pointing east, therefore we know that that way is north. And it is important that we check off the list of what we need, things such as the case number, the description of the contents, and the suspect's name and the victim's name. You will seal off the bag horizontally, and then you got to figure out the chain of custody, and it is very important because then you know who touched what and when. You need to protect the evidence from contamination by using gloves, use disposable instruments, air dry the evidence, mostly use paper bags, try not to cough, sneeze, and all that kind of stuff to prevent contamination. Evidence 1 is the knife. The fingerprints are individual because that pinpoints it down to one person, but the blood type would just be class evidence as it is a broad spectrum of people. Evidence 2 is the shorts, and the blood stain makes it individual because it brings it down to one person. Evidence 3 is the hair under the nails. This is class evidence because the hair could be a wide spectrum of people with that kind of hair. Evidence 4 would be the blood under the fingernails, and that is individual because it's DNA of one person. Evidence 5 is the hair on the victim. That is class evidence because that could be anybody with that hair type. Evidence 1, the knife, we used gloves on the hands. You use gauze to absorb / dry the blood and scrape it into the envelopes, place and immobilize into a cardboard box. The labs we will use is a fingerprint lab, serologist, and forensic biology DNA. Evidence 2, the shorts on neighbor number 2. Use gloves, and once dry, cover stain with clean paper and put that into a brown bag The labs we will use is the forensic biology and the serologist. Evidence 3, the hair under the nails. He used gloves, tweezers, and used the tweezers to put that into the envelopes. Stick to tape, take comparison samples. The labs we will use is the forensics microscope and microscopy. Evidence 4, the blood under the nails, gloves. If dry, scrape into small envelope. If wet, use gauze, then dry and put in envelope bag and make it refrigerated or freeze it. The labs you use is the DNA lab. Evidence 5 is the hair on the victim. Use gloves, use tweezers to put said hair into the envelope, and then the evidence bag, and then the labs we use is the forensic comparison microscopy. Evidence 1, the knife. We have fingerprints, dust, lift, and use the APHIS and get fingerprints of suspects. Evidence 1, the knife. You have the blood. Evidence 2, the shorts on neighbor number 2. Evidence 4, blood under the nails. Use DNA restriction enzymes to cut DNA into fragments. Use PER machine, polymerase chain reflection, to make thousands of copies. Use gelatorophoresis to create DNA fingerprints. Evidence 1, the knife. There's blood. Evidence 2 is the blood on the shorts. Evidence 4 is the blood under the nails. Compare 2 suspects and use CODIS. Evidence 3 is the hair under the nails. Evidence 5 is the hair on the victim. Comparison, the microscopy. Use the microscope, determine human, animal, length, etc. Evidence 5 have hair on dog hair, light curly. Evidence 2, blood on the neighbor. Number 2, shorts, canine. Evidence 1, the knife, fingerprints, victim, husband, neighbor, number 1. Evidence 3 is the hair under the nails, human, long, blonde. Evidence 1, knife, blood come from victim. Evidence 4, blood under nails, neighbor, number 1. Evidence number 1, knife, fingerprints. Neighbor number 2, not guilty. Evidence number 5, hair on the victim. Evidence number 2, husband is not guilty. Evidence number 1, knife fingerprints. Evidence number 4, blood is wider nails, not his, no scratches. Evidence number 3 is the hair under the nails, not consistent with his short brown hair. Neighbor number 1, evidence number 1 is the knife. Fingerprints is a check, but known to have knife. Evidence 3 is hair, wider nails, consistent with the color and the length. Evidence number 4, the blood under nails, confirmed probably from scratches. Neighbor number 1 is guilty.